December 26, 1991. The world woke up to headlines that seemed impossible just years earlier. The Soviet Union, the empire that had terrified the West for decades. The superpower that launched the first human into space. The nation that controlled nearly 1/6 of Earth's land surface had simply ceased to exist. No massive war brought it down. No revolution stormed the Kremlin. No foreign army marched through Moscow. Instead, it collapsed from within, like a giant dying from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. How does an empire that survived Hitler's invasion, that transformed from an agricultural backwater into a nuclear superpower in just 2 generations, suddenly vanish from the map? The answer isn't what most people think. When we imagine the fall of empires, we picture dramatic scenes. Rome burning while Nero fiddles. Constantinople's walls finally breached after 1,000 years. The last helicopter leaving Saigon. But the Soviet collapse was different. It was bureaucrats signing papers. It was empty store shelves that had been empty for years. It was young men refusing to report for military duty. It was coal miners striking in Siberia while party officials debated economic theory. The mundane nature of its end makes it even more fascinating because it reveals a truth about power that every empire tries to ignore. Real power doesn't come from missiles or tanks or secret police. It comes from belief. And by 1991, nobody believed in the Soviet dream anymore, not even the men running it. Consider this stunning fact. In 1985, the Soviet military was the largest in human history, with over 5 million soldiers under arms by 1991. Couldn't even mount a successful coup in its own capital. In 1980, Soviet athletes dominated the Olympics. Soviet scientists were respected worldwide. Soviet ideology had adherents on every continent. By 1990, Soviet citizens were learning about their own history from foreign broadcasts because they could untrust their own newspapers. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. It was the culmination of decisions made in marble halls by men who thought they were saving their system while actually signing its death warrant. The story really begins not with Gorbachev or Reagan or even Brezhnev, but with a fundamental contradiction built into the Soviet system from day one. The Communist Party claimed to represent the workers, but it feared them. It promised abundance, but delivered scarcity. It preached international brotherhood while building walls to keep its citizens from leaving. These contradictions could be managed when the economy was growing, when there was genuine belief in the communist future, when the memory of World War II united the nation in shared sacrifice. But what happens when the economy stagnates? When belief fades? When the war generation dies off? What happens when the lies become too obvious to ignore? Take the simple act of buying meat in 1980s Moscow. Officially, Soviet Union produced more than enough food for its citizens. The statistics said so. The party congresses celebrated record harvests, yet somehow ordinary people spent hours in lines for basic groceries, carried string bags everywhere just in case they stumbled upon something worth buying. They maintained complex networks of friends and favors to obtain goods that should have been freely available. This wasn't a temporary crisis. This was daily life for millions of people, year after year, decade after decade. Everyone knew the party officials didn't stand in those lines. They had special stores, special hospitals, special schools for their children. The workers' paradise had become an aristocracy, and everyone could see it. The war in Afghanistan shattered another illusion. The Soviet army, the force that had crushed Hitler, was being humiliated by mountain tribesmen with outdated weapons. Young conscripts came home in zinc coffins or missing limbs, traumatized and angry. They talked about the futility of the war, the incompetence of their officers, the lies in the official media. The government that had celebrated every military victory since 1945 tried to hide this war, pretending it wasn't happening even as the casualties mounted. Mothers formed committees to find out what had happened to their sons. Veterans spoke openly about their experiences, despite official pressure to remain silent. The myth of Soviet military invincibility, carefully cultivated for decades, crumbled in the mountains of Afghanistan. Then came Chernobyl, the disaster that revealed every pathology of the Soviet system in a single catastrophic event. The reactor exploded because of design flaws that engineers knew about, but couldn't discuss. The initial response was denial and cover-up. rather than evacuation and treatment. Local officials were more afraid of Moscow's anger than radiation poisoning. International help was refused to maintain the fiction that nothing serious had happened. Children played in radioactive dust while bureaucrats argued about whether to cancel May Day parades. When the truth finally emerged, it wasn't from Soviet sources, but from Swedish radiation detectors and Western news reports. The government that claimed to protect its citizens had knowingly exposed them to deadly radiation rather than admit a mistake. For the government, Chernobyl was the ultimate unmasking. It confirmed every suspicion the Soviet people had about their leaders, that they were incompetent, that they were liars, and that they valued the party's reputation over the lives of their own citizens. And into this crisis of faith stepped a new kind of Soviet leader. Mikhail Gorbachev was not like the aging, stony-faced apparatchiks who had preceded him. He was younger, energetic, and he seemed to genuinely believe he could reform the system. He wasn't trying to destroy the Soviet Union. He was trying to save it. He saw the stagnation, the corruption, the technological backwardness, and he knew that without drastic change, the entire project was doomed. His solution was a two-pronged attack. A pair of Russian words that would soon be known around the globe: Perestroika and Glasnost. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, was his attempt to fix the broken Soviet economy. The old command and control system, where bureaucrats in Moscow decided how many shoes a factory in Minsk should produce, was a disaster. It created massive waste, stifled innovation, and produced goods nobody wanted. Gorbachev's idea was to introduce elements of market economics. He allowed for small, private businesses, called cooperatives. He gave state-owned factories more autonomy to make their own decisions. He sought foreign investment. On paper, it sounded sensible. In reality, it was like trying to perform heart surgery with a sledgehammer. The reforms were chaotic and half-hearted. The old system was dismantled before a new one could be built, creating an economic no man's land. The new cooperatives, often run by well-connected individuals, could charge market prices, making their owners rich, while ordinary workers on fixed state salaries saw their savings wiped out by soaring inflation. State factories, now responsible for their own budgets, started laying off workers. The result wasn't a revitalized socialist economy. It was economic chaos. Store shelves, already sparse, became even emptier. The lines grew longer. For the average citizen, Perestroika didn't mean progress. It meant poverty. Gorbachev had promised a better life, but he was delivering the opposite. The social contract, which had promised stability and basic necessities in exchange for political freedom, was broken. But it was his second policy, glasnost, or openness, that proved to be the fatal blow. Gorbachev understood that economic reform was impossible without a freer flow of information. Couldn't fix problems if you weren't allowed to talk about them. He eased censorship, allowed for more open debate in the media, and began releasing political prisoners. He thought a little bit of truth would act like a disinfectant, cleaning out the corruption and making the system stronger. But what happens when you tell a patient who thought they had a common cold that they actually have stage 4 cancer? Glasnost didn't just reveal a few problems. It revealed that the entire history of the Soviet Union was built on a foundation of lies. Suddenly, newspapers were publishing articles about Stalin's purges, which had killed millions. They wrote about the deliberate famine in Ukraine, the Holodomor. They revealed the secret protocols of the treaty with Nazi Germany that had carved up Poland, exposed the environmental catastrophes, like the shrinking of the Aral Sea, caused by decades of reckless industrial policy. Every pillar of Soviet legitimacy was systematically demolished. The heroes were revealed to be monsters. The triumphs were shown to be tragedies. The workers' paradise was exposed as a prison camp. For 70 years, the party had controlled the past, present, and future. Glasnost destroyed that control in a matter of months. And with the destruction of the official history came the rebirth of real history. The Soviet Union was not one nation. It was an empire, a collection of dozens of distinct nationalities, Ukrainians, Georgians, Latvians, Uzbeks, and more who had been conquered and forcibly absorbed by Moscow. For decades, their national identities had been suppressed. Now, under Glasnost, they could speak their own languages, celebrate their own cultures, and most importantly, talk about their own history of occupation. In the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been independent countries before being illegally annexed in 1940, mass movements for independence exploded. In August 1989, 2 million people formed a human chain stretching over 600 kilometers across all 3 states, a stunning and peaceful demonstration demanding their freedom. Similar movements flared up in Georgia, in Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The poison of nationalism, which the Soviets thought they had cured, came roaring back. Gorbachev, the man who wanted to reform the Union, was now presiding over its rapid dissolution. He had opened the door to let in some fresh air, and a hurricane had swept in, tearing the entire house apart. The military, once the iron fist of Soviet power, was rotting from within. The numbers tell a story of stunning decline. In 1985, the Soviet armed forces numbered 5.3 million men, the largest peacetime military in history. By 1991, it had shrunk to barely 2.7 million, and many of those existed only on paper. The Afghanistan debacle had broken the army's spirit. Young men were dodging the draft in unprecedented numbers. Those who did serve faced brutal hazing, ethnic tensions, and collapsing morale. Officers were selling military equipment on the black market just to feed their families. Nuclear weapons, the ultimate guarantee of Soviet power, were scattered across republics that were declaring independence. The proud Red Army that had planted its flag on the Reichstag was now an exhausted, demoralized force that couldn't even control its own barracks. Meanwhile, the economy wasn't just struggling, it was disintegrating. The Soviet Union had always been good at producing things nobody wanted, while failing to produce things everybody needed. They could build intercontinental ballistic missiles, but not reliable cars. They could launch space stations, but not manufacture decent televisions. This misallocation of resources had been masked for decades by oil exports. But when oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, the mask came off. The government was essentially bankrupt. They were printing money to cover their debts, causing inflation to spiral out of control. Workers were being paid in rubles that were worth less every day. The black market became the real economy, where dollars and cigarettes were the true currency. Industrial production was collapsing. The transportation system was breaking down. In some regions, people were reverting to barter, trading goods directly because money had become meaningless. The Communist Party itself was fracturing hardliners, watched in horror as everything they had built was being dismantled. They saw Gorbachev not as a reformer, but as a traitor. A man who was giving away the empire their fathers had died to create. Reformers thought Gorbachev was moving too slowly, but half measures were making things worse. Regional party bosses were switching sides, transforming themselves from communist officials into nationalist leaders. Boris Yeltsin, once a party insider, had reinvented himself as a populist Democrat, directly challenging Gorbachev's authority. The party that had once moved in lockstep was now engaged in open civil war. Then came August 1991, the last desperate gasp of the old guard. A group of hardliners, including the defense minister, the KGB chief, and other senior officials, staged a coup while Gorbachev was on vacation in Crimea. They declared a state of emergency, sent tanks into Moscow, and announced that they were saving the country from chaos. It should have worked. They controlled the military, the security services, the media, but something had fundamentally changed. The soldiers they sent into Moscow were confused kids who didn't want to shoot their own people. The population, instead of cowering in fear as they might have done a decade earlier, came out to oppose the coup. Boris Yeltsin, in one of history's most iconic moments, climbed on top of a tank and called for resistance. The image was broadcast around the world, the president of the Russian Republic standing on a Soviet tank, not to support it, but to oppose it. The coup collapsed in 3 days. The hardliners were arrested, but in defeating the coup, the last threads holding the Soviet Union together were severed. What followed was a cascade of independence declarations. Ukraine, the second largest republic and the agricultural heartland of the Union, voted for independence with over 90% support. Belarus, Kazakhstan, the Central Asian republics all began going their own way. Gorbachev was now president of a country that effectively no longer existed. He was giving orders that nobody followed. making speeches that nobody listened to. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly and signed an agreement dissolving the Soviet Union and creating something called the Commonwealth of Independent States. They didn't even invite Gorbachev. The man who had tried to save the Soviet Union wasn't even present at its funeral. The final act came on Christmas Day, 1991. Gorbachev gave a short, dignified speech resigning as president of a nation that had already disappeared. At 7:32 p.m., the red flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place rose the tricolor flag of Russia. There were no crowds cheering or weeping, no violence, no drama, just a flag coming down and another going up. The Soviet Union, which had promised to bury capitalism, which had terrified the world with its nuclear arsenal, which had controlled the destinies of hundreds of millions, ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. So why did it collapse? The truth is that it died from 1,000 cuts, each one self-inflicted. It was an empire that couldn't feed its people while maintaining the world's largest military. It was a system based on lies that couldn't survive the truth. It was a multinational state that suppressed nationalism until it exploded. It was an economy that couldn't compete, a military that couldn't win, a party that couldn't adapt. Gorbachev's reforms meant to save it, instead exposed its fatal weaknesses. The Soviet Union didn't fall because of Reagan or the Pope or the CIA. It fell because it was a house of cards. And once people stopped believing in it, once they stopped fearing it, there was nothing left to hold it up. In the end, the workers' paradise collapsed because the workers simply walked away.